وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت عليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وقد نوينا التعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير ونفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى ودلالة على الخير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah, in our discussions on the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri alayhi rahmatullah ta'ala wa nafa'ana bihi, we've reached the section of menstruation and Lochia or nifas, or some books, some translations would say postnatal bleeding, which is a lot easier to say. Right? But the basis of this chapter, right, are the verses of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, He says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيضِ, that they ask you about the menstruation. قُلْ هِيَ أَذَى, say that it's a type of harm. فَاعْتَزِلُوا النِّسَاءَ فِي الْمَحِيضِ. So the discourse is addressed to the men first and foremost, right, saying that then stay away from the women in the mahid, in the menstruation. Now, in previous religions or traditions, I should say other religions, there was an excess in this idea of i'tizal an-nisa, right, staying away from the women in hayd, where Islam dispels majority of that. In other traditions, that it was not even permissible to eat from the same vessel as a woman in the menstruation, right? It wasn't, you couldn't sleep in the same bed, and Islam completely abolished all of that, right? And none of that has anything to do with Islam. Right? There are certain things that are prevented, right? But it is in no way, shape, or form seen as a decrease in the dignity of the woman. Rather, it is, right, it is part of that miracle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed the woman with. Right? It has to do with childbirth. Right? It's a direct relationship to childbirth, right? And the women have been blessed with that role over men, right? As Sheikh Abdul Hakim Marad was saying, that if you want to talk about statistics, 100% of the people who give birth are women. Right? If you want to talk about statistics, right? So, and that role as a mother is a great honor, right? And there is Quranic and prophetic guidance regarding this, right? So Allah says, stay away from the women in the time of the mahid, the menstruation, and nifas, the postnatal bleeding is also, it takes the same exact rulings, right? Because they have the same exact illah, the same exact legal cause, which is hiya adha, that it is a type of harm, right? So because of the legal reasoning being shared between the two, they both take the same exact ruling. So he says, فِي ذَاتَ طَهَرْنَا حَتَّى يَطْهُرْنَا. So stay away from the women until they become pure. And there's, right, the wording is very important in the verse. Until they become pure. يَطْهُرْنَا, especially in the qira'at of Warsh, Hafs, sorry, the recitation of Hafs, right, يَطْهُرْنَا, so they become pure. Right? فَإِذَا تَطَهَّرْنَا فَأْتُوهُنَّ مِنْ حَيْثُ أَمَرَكُمُ اللَّهُ. Then when they make themselves pure, then come to them in the way that Allah has prescribed. Right? So this verse is filled with lots of meaning, right, that the scholars of jurisprudence and of the legal tradition have derived from it, the basic rules, as well as the hadith. The hadith are quite explicit, right, in these things, right? And generally the basis is that إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَسْتَحْيِي عَنِ الْحَقِّ, that Allah does not shy away from that which is true. So even though these things are not, right, common discourse and, right, But in regards to teaching and for people to know the guidance, these things should not be shied away from discussion. Right? It is obligatory to know, right, how to calculate the menstruation, what are the rules related to the menstruation, right? And part of that onus is on the husband to facilitate by either teaching the wife or granting or being the means of accessing scholars or teachers or books that are necessary. And just like it is obligatory to calculate one's wealth in order to keep in mind the rulings of the zakat, the same thing is obligatory for a woman to keep track of her menstruation, right, in order for her to follow the rulings of the menstruation. Right, so the word in Arabic for menstruation is hayd, ha, the big ha, ya, dad, right, hayd. Now, halda yahidu means to flow, sala yasidu. So, halda al-wadi ida sala. Right, the valley flowed with water. Right, right, halda al-wadi, you would say. Right, but legally, right, we have a very specific definition for the menstruation. So, it is considered damun, right, as Imam Quduri alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala will explain. Right, that is damun yakhruju min rahimin imra'atin salimatin an da'in. Right, and then, right, so it is a type of blood that comes forth from the womb. Right, so its source is the womb. Right, from a mature woman, so she has to be adult. So mature meaning adult woman who is healthy. Right, healthy from any sicknesses that would cause bleeding from other than the womb. Right, so we'll talk about what that means in a bit. Right, that she must be mature. Right, so the minimum age that a woman legally could be considered to have menstruation is 9 years old. Right, and 9 years old, according to the lunar calendar, is a little bit less than 9. Right, so it's 8 and some 10, like 10 months or so. Right, so they must be adult. If they're younger than that and they see blood, that's not considered hayd, and the rulings of hayd do not apply to her. Okay, right, who is not pregnant, right? So any woman who is pregnant, they may see spotting and these different things. That is not considered menstruation, right? They continue to pray, they continue to do everything as normal, right? Because it's not really a scientific definition, but right, the scholars agreed that insadda famur rahim عند الحبل, that the womb closes when a child is born. Right, when the woman becomes pregnant. Right, so anything that comes out, it's a sign that did not come out from the rahim, it did not come out from the womb. Right, and then nor are they considered legally in a state of menopause. Right, so the reason why I say legally considered in a state of menopause, because right, menopause generally would be when the woman's menstruation cycle stops. When the menstrual cycle stops, and that's called menopause. But in the Islamic tradition, there's a specific age. Right? The age of sinnul iyas, the age of menopause. Right? So if you reach that age, right, then you're considered menopausal, and even if one still has bleeding, unless the bleeding is of a certain type, right, then one would consider, would go back to the same rulings as before. Right? And the age itself is differed on according to different cultures. Right? The general age of a woman would reach menopause in one country may be different than another. Right? So what's mentioned in the books is on the basis of like Bukhara and like some of the Uzbek countries, that it's 55. That's 55. Some said 60. Right? But we'll discuss that as it comes. So Imam al-Quduri, he says, أقل الحيض ثلاثة أيام ولياليها. Right? That the minimum of hayd is 3 days, and days meaning 72 hours. It doesn't mean that, okay, if you get your hayd at nights, so that's one night, because the word for 3 days in Arabic is ثلاثة أيام ولياليها, is 3 days and nights. So it means 72 hours. It doesn't just mean 3 mornings, right? It's not 3 mornings, right? So if you get your hayd that night, that doesn't count. You have to wait till the next morning. No, it's 72 hours exactly. Right, so if blood comes forth from the womb of a mature woman, and it's not due to some sort of sickness, right, and it's not when she's in a state of pregnancy, right, nor when she's in a state of menopause, then it's considered menstruation. Right? But the second criteria is that it must continue for 3 days. Right? And when we say continue, it doesn't mean constant without any stopping, but there must be the presence of that menstruation for 3 days, 72 hours. Right? And we'll talk about how to calculate that in a second. The maximum amounts that it could continue is 10 days, right? 240 hours. Right, so Imam Quduri says, وَمَا نَقَصَ عَنْ ذَلِكَ فَلَيْسَ بِحَيْضٍ وَهُوَ istihada. Right, and so whatever is less than the minimum is not considered hayd. So for instance, a woman has, if we use the Gregorian calendar, say January 1st, she sees blood. Okay, so she stops praying. She acts as if this is going to be hayd, even though she won't know technically until later, because the minimum is 3 days. Right, so she stops, she acts as if this is the menstruation. Right, and then, so if she doesn't see anything at all, right, and now say it's the 15th of January, right, and still nothing else, then it's in retrospect, it is known that that one day was not hayd, because it didn't get to 3. Right? We'll talk about how to calculate at what point do you know that was not hayd. At what point? Right. But if in the end it's found out that it did not reach 3 days, or if it was any less than 72 hours, then it is not considered hayd. Right. So the responsibility on the woman is to act on what is apparent. Right. If you see blood, you act as if it's hayd. Right. If later on you were found out to be wrong, then you act accordingly. You make up whatever you have to make up, or you consider, because if you were in a state of hayd, right? I mean, if it was not considered menstrual bleeding, right? Then you just go back. Okay, how many prayers did I not pray, thinking that there was hayd, and then just remake them up. There's no sin on you, right? There's no accountability, because you did not know at that time. Tamam. But we'll give some criteria to where you can tell, kind of have some sort of idea of what's going on. So the maximum is 10 days, right? So now if a woman sees blood, right, for January 1st, right, 2nd, 3rd, a little bit, then there might be a day or two that there's nothing, and then it comes back 6th, 7th, 8th, 10th, right? But then 11th, 12th, 13th, and it continues, right? So now we know that, right, with certainty, that after it finishes, it goes above that 10 days, that we know that now this is not considered hayd, right? This is too much. It's beyond the maximum. Right, so anything below the minimum or above the maximum is called something else. It's called istihada, irregular bleeding, which is seen as a type of da', right? It's a type of sickness, right? Not necessarily that you're sick, but it's not from the womb. It's not considered as blood from the womb, so it doesn't meet the criteria of the menstruation. Other forms of irregular blood are other things that go against the conditions that we mentioned in the beginning, right? That the woman must be mature, right? Not pregnant, not in menopause. So if a girl were to see blood before 9 years old, right, that is not considered hayd, right? Legally, it is considered irregular bleeding, and she continues to pray, and just like if she was in a state of purity. Also, if a woman is pregnant and she sees spotting or any blood, then it is considered istihada, irregular bleeding. Right? And irregular bleeding does not right, have the same rulings as menstruation. Right? Also, if a woman is beyond the age of menopause, then any bleeding is seen is not considered hayd. Right? But there's conditions to that. Right? right? So practically, right, if a woman sees blood, then she stops praying. And she stops praying, right? She considers it to be the menstruation, right? Once it reaches 3 days, then she's certain that it's menstruation. There's no need to make up any prayers from before, right? Or the like. We'll talk about the rulings in a second, right? But then it stops. Now, if it stops, and sometimes, right, it's part of the habits that you'll see blood for a few days, and then a stop, and then a little bit more, and then stop, right? If it's such that you are reasonably sure it's finished, right, then you act as if it's finished. You take your shower, right, and you continue to pray. If it comes back, then you're not accountable for what you did. You didn't have to pray, right? So you would just continue to act as if it's still hayd until it is finished. So we'll be expressing more examples, inshallah, as we go. Right. So Imam al-Quduri, he says, وَالْحَيْضُ يُسْقِطُ عَنِ الْحَائِضِ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُحَرِّمُ عَلَيْهَا الصَّوْمِ. That the menstruation, the wording that he uses is really interesting. He says the menstruation drops the prayer off of her responsibility. Right? So the prayer is not obligatory on her. Right? But then he says, وَيُحَرِّمُ عَلَيْهَا الصَّوْمِ. But fasting is prohibited for her. Right? Fasting is prohibited for her. Okay, so when the salat time comes in, it's as if Allah is announcing to all of the believers, pray salat. Right? But there is, right? So it is obligatory on every believer to pray salat. But those who have menstruation, it excludes them from that. Right? So the prayer is obligatory, but not on you. Right? So that's why he says the prayer is not obligatory on her. Right? The responsibility to pray is relieved from her, not others. Right? Right. So but fasting, right, it's not even obligatory on her, and that she's just excused from the obligation. She is not allowed to fast. Right? It is not allowed to fast. Right? And for this breakup, that's why the fasting is made up, and the prayer is not. Right? A woman came to Sayyidah Aisha. She says that what's up with this ruling that we have to make up our fast but not our prayers? So Sayyidah Aisha, she says something really interesting. She said, "Haruriya ta anti?" Like the Haruriya were a tribe that were really rigid literalists. Sounds familiar, huh? Right? They're really this like staunch kind of. They had these weird understandings, really superficial understandings. She said, "What's up with this?" In a really objecting type of way. Right? And then she said, "That's what Allah said. That's it. You make up the fast." But there's wisdom. There is wisdom. The amount of fasts that a person would have to make in a whole year, right, because of menstruation would be much less than even one menstrual cycle may have 20, 30 salats easy, right? And that would be very difficult, right? So because of the difficulty involved, that's one of the wisdoms, but generally the ruling is because Allah said so. Allah and His Messenger told us. Right, so the prayer, right, she does not pray, she does not fast, right, but and now she has the same rulings that would apply to someone who's in a ritual state of impurity would apply to her. Right, now the menstruation itself, right, it's considered a type of ritual impurity, but the obligation to make a ghusl is dependent on the blood stopping. Right, so whereas somebody else who is in a state of ritual impurity for other reasons, right, they have to make ghusl. Right. It's not dependent on anything, especially if the prayer time is there. Right. Right. So just like the one in the ritual impurity, which is called al-junub, the person who is in a major state of ritual impurity, they cannot enter the masjid. Right. Now, entering the masjid, right, includes just passing through. Right. And that wouldn't really apply to our times now. Right, but in the old times, they would have very small cities, and sometimes the only way to get from one place to another is to cut through the masjid. Right, and people would do that. So that would be, in the Shafi'i school, that's permitted. If you're just passing by and you're not stopping, then you can. you can pass by even if you're in a state of menstruation, but in the Hanafi school you cannot. Right? Unless obviously you're being chased by somebody who's trying to kill you, you can run in the masjid, right? And that's different, right? Emergencies, you tend to allow lots of things. This would include the actual prayer area, or the area that's designated for the prayer, and anything that is considered as an overflow area for the prayer, right? Specifically for the prayer area though. Right, so if this area is known to be the area where people pray, then, but if the masjid has like a courtyard or like a hallway, or like some masjids, they have like desks and secretaries in the front, and then you go like to the actual prayer area. That area is fine, you can do that. Some masjids have classrooms upstairs and around, right? That is fine as well. And then some places are considered musalla. They're a place of prayer, but they're not necessarily a masjid, sharia, right, considered masjid. Right? So in that situation, stay away from like the actual place of prayer. But in general, it doesn't take the rulings of a full masjid. So the classrooms and the like are okay. Okay, so the fourth thing that is not allowed is the tawaf. Now, right, if you want to be really picky, right, you would understand what I'm about to say. Don't you make the tawaf in the masjid? Some people get it right away. Yeah, so right, the tawaf itself, right, it cannot be done, especially if you have to be in the masjid to do it. Right? But the reason I mention this is that if you're already in the masjid and then you get your menstruation, right, mid-tawaf, then you have to stop the tawaf and do it later. Right? So unless you've already done 4, and then that's for Hajj. Right? You do that in Hajj. So technically they're the same thing, really, unless you're like walking around the entire Masjid al-Haram, which would probably be the greatest workout ever. It's a huge building. Number 5 is that intimacy with the spouse is prohibited. Right now, what is prohibited is skin-to-skin contact between the navel and the knee of the woman. Skin-to-skin contact between the navel and the knee of the woman, whether it's with desire or not, it's prohibited. Right? And it's prohibited for the husband to do that, knowing that his spouse is in menstruation. Right? And it's prohibited for the wife to allow it if she's in menstruation. Right? However, right, if it's between the navel and the knees and there's a barrier, it's not skin-to-skin contact, it's allowed. Right? It is allowed, even if there is desire. Right? And anywhere besides between the navel and the knees is allowed, right, without any doubt. Right? So, right, with desire or no desire, the only thing that is prohibited is skin-to-skin contact between the navel and the knees. So, there are some narrations in the books of fiqh that if a person, for instance, does have intercourse with his spouse during the menstruation, that they should make tawbah, and part of the tawbah is that they give some charity. They give some money in charity. To do that knowingly is sinful. It's very sinful. But if there was an accident, right, she didn't know that she was in menstruation, then you can make that expiation. Right? But it's a recommendation, it's not an obligation. The sixth thing is to touch the mushaf. So like anybody in the major state of ritual impurity, the menstruating woman cannot touch the mushaf. Right? Now the mushaf is that which is a copy of the Quran itself. Right? That which is known to be the Quran. That between the front cover and the second cover is nothing but Quran. Right? That's a mushaf. Right now, if you have a tafsir, like some of the new copies of like Tafsir Jalalain, they'll have like a little window in the top corner with the actual page of the Quran, but small, and then they'll have the tafsir around. That would still be considered mushaf because the whole Quran is there, right, in sequence. Right? But if you have a different type of tafsir, where it's right, ayah here, then a tafsir, another ayah here, then tafsir, and then that would be a more relaxed ruling, but still, right, the caution would dictate to not do that as well. But if it's something that's not a Quran or not a Mus'haf, like for instance you have a book on the biography of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And in there they bring verses once in a while, right? Then you can touch the book, but you cannot touch the actual ayat itself. Right? When it comes to the actual Mus'haf, you can't touch the ayah or even the white parts around it or even the covering. All of it is considered one. Tamam. We'll talk about in a second about the barrier. Some scholars, especially in other schools, have allowed for women in the state of menstruation to recite the Quran, to if not doing so would cause them to lose their memorization. Right? So there are other opinions, and if someone is actually taking a Quran class and the class happens to be right like at the time that she has her menstruation, and missing that class would cause difficulty, or she might not be able to learn the subject. Because if you ever taught a class of Quran, right, and the student misses a week, it's like you have to start all over. Right? So if she's trying to learn, right, and she's going to have to miss classes because of that, then there is room. So the last one is reciting the Quran itself. Right? To actually audibly recite the Quran is prohibited for, as the Prophet said, لا يقرأ الحائض والجنب شيئا من القرآن. The menstruating woman, nor anyone in a state of ritual impurity, major ritual impurity, should recite the Quran, recite anything of the Quran, he said. So it's quite emphatic. Right? However, things that are in the Quran but used for other purposes are allowed. So, for instance, your friend tells you that we just had a baby, and you say, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Right? So that is allowed, right? That's a dhikr, it's a type of dhikr. Or right, you're in difficulty, or you want to make tawbah or something, you say, La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu minal zalimin. Right? That's a type of dua. Or Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri. That's a type of dua that's allowed. Right. Also, on top of that, anything that would be used as like a spiritual routine of remembrance. Right. So, like if you're reading the Word Latif of Imam al-Haddad, or any compilation of prophetic du'as, it is part of the morning and evening routine is to read Ikhlas 3 times, right, Falaq 3 times, Nas 3 times, Ayatul Kursi, right? That's allowed. Right? And by extension, some would even allow like Surah Al-Waqi'ah and Surah Yasin, Surah Mulk before bed. So, but that would exclude anything like that's obviously not a dua or a dhikr, right? So like if you want to read Surah Al-Lahab, like nobody reads Surah Al-Lahab for spiritual routine, right, as a remembrance of Allah, or right, as a specific dua or something.
Let's say you didn't know Surah Yasin like by heart.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to hold something that has surahs.
Yeah, so you couldn't hold it, but you could have it like placed in front of you, right? But you wouldn't actually be touching it. There's a khilaf about the phone, right? But there's definitely the prohibition, actually touching the ayah is definitely prohibited. Right? Yes, some of our teachers are quite strict, and they would say even the phone itself, one that's on the screen, you can't touch it. Right? So that's quite strict. That's really strict actually. Right? But if it's like inside the Word Latif or something like that, and you have like the Khulasa or some book that has du'as in it and it has that surah in it, just don't touch the verses. Right? But that's a dispensation. If one wants to be cautious and take and not do that, then you're not missing out. You're not losing anything. Right? Generally, the dispensation is given so that people don't break their routines and people don't fall they don't make a habit of leaving it. Right? One of the scholars they mentioned that even if a woman cannot pray, right, she should not let that time go to waste. Right? That many of the scholars, especially in Tarim and Darul Zahra, the women's school, they would encourage the the women to take that time that they would normally pray and just do some dhikr, or do some or read like the seerah or something that's spiritually nourishing in that time, so as to continue the benefit. But at no point should a woman feel that they're missing out because they can't pray, right? And that is not true, right? Spiritual progression and coming closer to Allah is in obeying His commands, not in just the act itself, right? It's in the obeying of the command. Okay? And she is just as much obeying the command by not praying as the husband is by praying. Right. As far as touching the mushaf, for the one in a minor state of ritual impurity, it's only allowed if there is an unattached cover to the mushaf. Right? It's an unattached cover of the mushaf. Right. So some covers they have like sleeves that you can put the binding in, right? So that if you open it, the whole thing opens. Right? Once it's in there, it's considered attached. Right? And some of them it's literally attached. It's like glued on. Right? So you wouldn't be able to touch the cover itself if it's attached completely. Right? But if it's just something you cover it with, you just lay over the top, but it's not attached, or even something external, so like you have something in to hold it with. You're using that as a barrier. Then you're allowed to hold it with that. Generally, the scholars kind of frown on using something that's attached to you to do so. So like using your sleeve, because technically it's attached to you, it's as if you're touching it anyway. It's frowned upon, but even though it's still a type of barrier, right? But to use something else, especially, but best to use something respectful. Don't use like a dirty towel or something, and use something respectful, right? Even if it's just to move, if you want to move it to a different shelf or to put it out of the way or something. So that's allowed, right? But touching it directly is not allowed, right? If it's the actual mushaf, and then the same rulings apply as what we mentioned before. If it's like a book of seerah that has verses in it, then it's allowed, but it's recommended to not touch any book of Islamic importance without wudu. Even if it's a fiqh book, or if it's even if it's in English, or to have wudu would be recommended. And the scholars even mention if you're going to touch the Bible or the Torah or other religious tradition, right, or those specific ones, then to also have wudu, right, would be recommended, but not obligatory. Right, so if you're going to, for instance, if you're going to give a copy of the Quran to someone non-Muslim, then you just remind them that even in our tradition we respect your books. So please, right, we don't put the Bible on the ground. We respect it, because if there's even a fleck of truth that still remains, then we have to respect it. It's the verse of, right, even if the rest is changed. Right? So, Allahu Akbar. I think that covers that. If there's any questions, you could just jump in at any time.
When we say reciting with friends, so if we're moving our mouths, but it's not audible, it's not like...
No, it's considered, if you can hear yourself, then it's considered allowed, right? And out loud, meaning, right? If you can't hear yourself, then it's not considered recitation, and it's pretty much as if you're reading in your heart. Yeah, the basis is there sound coming out that you could hear? If there's no sound at all, you're just moving your mouth, and it's not considered recitation. So you can read in your heart, right? And many of the righteous would actually, they could read large portions of the Quran in their hearts, right? Just in their minds. I had one teacher that he would be able to revise a whole juz of Quran just by just running over in his mind the whole page. This verse, then this verse, without reading anything. Right? And then the next one. Really amazing. He could also tell you what number the verse was with quite accuracy. Okay, tamam. So now regarding the ghusl, we mentioned that the menstruation is seen as a type of ritual impurity, janabah, but the obligation to make the ghusl, right, is delayed until the termination of that menstrual cycle. Right, until the blood stops, you don't have to make a ghusl. Right, you don't make a ghusl until the blood stops. You can take a shower if you want, but to make a routine ritual ghusl with the intention of purity is not allowed, because it's prohibited. Because right, it wouldn't count, first of all, right, and right, it wouldn't be valid, and it would be seen as, right, something that is a waste of water if you're doing it for religious purposes only. Right? So if the menstruation, and back to the verse that we mentioned, فَإِذَا حَتَّى يَطْهُرْنَا, right, stay away from the women, meaning intimately, right, حَتَّى يَطْهُرْنَا, until they become pure. So it's an intrinsic action, it's a reflexive action, until they become pure. Right, so if the menstruation stops at the maximum, the 10th day, and then it stops, then it is allowed to have, for the husband and the wife to have intercourse even before they perform a ghusl. Even before the woman performs a ghusl. Right? Because it is considered that most definitely the womb is cleared. Right? The cycle is over. Because anything that would come out after that would not be considered hayd. It would be considered irregular bleeding. Right? And it doesn't have the same prohibitions as menstruation. Now, if the menstruation stops at less than 10, less than the maximum, right, then there's two considerations, right? Right, that if the menstruation stops at the same habit that she had in her previous cycle, right, then she can take a ghusl and she can have relations with her husband, right? But if it stops before her previous habit, right, so the habit is established by looking at the previous cycle. So last month it was 7 days, right? And this month it stops at 5 days. So it stops before the habit. So between 5 days and 7 days, right, she's considered pure, but she cannot have intercourse until the habit itself is reached, because the possibility of the blood returning, right, within the scope of her habit is very likely. So the prohibition of intimacy is up until the habit. But say like last month it was 7 days, and this month it stops at 7 days, then she can take her bath, and then everything's permissible. Right. So, but if her menstruation finishes before the maximum, she has to take a bath in order for the intimacy to be permissible, or one whole salat time has to go out. That one prayer time goes out, that she has enough, and this is usually in the situation, two situations, one is much more rare than the other, that she becomes pure just at the ending of the time, and she didn't have time to go make ghusl. That she had enough time to make the ghusl, and that applies to undressing, making the ghusl, right? And then starting the prayer, Allahu Akbar. If there's that much time, right, then once that prayer time goes out, then she's considered that she's pure. Right? That she could, not that she's, that she's considered that pure, she did take the shower, right? Even if she didn't take the shower, she had enough time to, and enough time to start the prayer, then she could have intercourse. But if she's going to pray, she has to take the full shower. She has to. Right? So sometimes these details are quite confusing. Okay, so three things. Right? If it stops at 10 days, right, she can have intercourse before taking a shower, before taking the ritual bath, the ghusl. Right? If it stops at less than 10 days, but at the same as her habit from the previous month, then she can just takes a bath. She can have relationship. She can have intimate relations. Right? If it stops for less than her habit, then she takes a bath, prays her prayers as normal, but she cannot have intercourse until the habit time is finished. Right? If her menstruation finishes at the end of finishes, and there remains in the prayer time enough time that she could have gone and taken a bath, and started the prayer at least, right? Right, then she technically could have intercourse without taking a shower. Right? Obviously, if she's going to pray, she would actually have to take a shower. Right? But the hypothetical situation that if a prayer time goes out after her menstruation finished, she's considered pure because that prayer is in her responsibility. Right? And for her being obliged to pray is one of the rulings that is given to pure women, to a woman who's in a state of purity. Right? The other circumstance kind of makes this clear. The other circumstance is if a man is married to a woman who doesn't pray. Right? And because she doesn't pray, she doesn't generally follow the rulings of ghusl as well. Right? So if a man is married to a woman who wouldn't normally take a ghusl when her menstruation is finished, right? Does that mean he can never have intimacy with her because she doesn't take a ghusl? Right? No. So once a prayer time goes out, right, he can have intercourse with her even if she didn't take a ghusl. So that's usually why this ruling is mentioned. Right? But if a woman, her menstruation finishes, right, just before, like for instance, Maghrib comes in. Say Maghrib comes in at, what is it, 6:30 now or something like that? Say Maghrib comes in at 6:30, right? She realizes that she's pure at 6:27. Right? Is there enough time to make a ghusl and say Allahu Akbar? Right? Say a ghusl, get fully dressed, right? Enough to cover the awrah, and then say Allahu Akbar. Is that enough time? 3 minutes? Right? No. Right? So she doesn't have to pray that prayer. Right? But if it stopped, say 10 minutes before Maghrib came in, right? Is that enough time to make a full ghusl and dress? I mean, you're not going to like shampoo and exfoliate and, I mean, just bare minimum ghusl and come dress quickly and say Allahu Akbar. Is that enough time? 10 minutes? It's enough time, right? So that prayer, even if she didn't get to accomplish that quick ghusl and pray, right, that prayer has to be made up later on, because that prayer is in her responsibility, because she had the ability to have done it. So it's quite interesting ruling. Right, so the habit is quite important. The habit is important to recall and to keep track of what the previous cycle, right, the length of the previous cycle is very important. Right, because we see many rulings are based on what was the previous cycle. And this applies to both the menstruation and the postnatal bleeding. Right, and many people don't know that specific ruling that we just mentioned, that if a woman, her previous menstruation was 7 days, right, and this month it's 5 days, that there still cannot be any intimacy until the 7th day, because of the likelihood of her habits continuing, right, up to 7 days. Now, if she had menstruation last month 7 days, and this month 5 days, her new habit is 5. Right, so every time it changes, the habit changes, and the habit is what your previous month was. In between two menstruations, or an easier way will be in between two bloods, two bleedings. Right? So between a menstruation and another menstruation, or between postnatal bleeding and a menstruation, right? There has to be a minimum of 15 days of nothing, of complete purity. 15 days of complete purity, right? In order for those two bleedings to be considered separate from each other. In order for them to be considered separate from each other. Right, so if a woman has her menstruation for, let's try to use round numbers so I don't get caught into a math equation. Say she has her menstruation from January 1st to January 5th, 5 days. Right? And then she experiences blood again on the 16th to the 20th. How much time was between the two bleedings? So the 16th to the 20th and the 1st to the 5th. How much time is in between? 10 days, right? So because it is that the time of purity, the tuhr, is not 15 days, those two bloods are considered one, and everything in between is considered as if the blood was continuing. Right? So 10 of, right? So that's a lot of days, though. Right? So that's 5, and then 10 in the middle. All of it's considered as bleeding. Right? The maximum, right, is 10. Everything else is considered, right, irregular bleeding. Right? We'll take the details because there's one thing I left out, but we'll talk about that in a second. So the minimum purity that would separate two different types of blood or two bleedings, right, is 15 days. It's 15 days. So in order for you to say that this was one hayd and this is a different hayd, right, there has to be 15 days of nothing in between. Now there's no maximum to the purity. Right? It's very possible that a woman never gets menstruation, or a woman has once a year, or once. It might be very rare, but it's possible. Right? So it doesn't matter how long it goes up to, but it has a minimum 15 days. Right? So if it's less than 15 days of purity in between two bleedings, then those two bleedings are considered, are combined, and then we look at how many days and so forth. So let's just give a scenario to help us with this. So say a woman sees blood for 3 days. A woman sees blood for 3 days. Right? So that's the minimum. Right? That's definitely hayd, definitely menstruation. Right? And then she sees nothing for 5 days. So this is a more practical scenario. Right? So she sees blood for 3 days, she sees nothing for 5 days, and then she sees blood for 2 days. Right? How many is that total? 3, 5, and 2. Come on, guys. 10, right? So 3 days of blood, 5 days of nothing, 2 days of blood, right? 5 days is not a significant amount of, a sufficient amount of time to consider each blood individually. That because it's less than 15, the 3 days in the beginning and the 2 days in the end are combined, right? And everything in between is considered as bleeding days as well. Right? So all the total 10 days is as if blood was there for 10 days. Right, so what is her menstruation in this period? 10 days. Right, so 3 days blood, 5 days of nothing. 5 is not enough to cancel out the hayd. Right? And then 2, so all 10 days is blood. All 10 days is hayd. Right, so we see that it's not a condition that there's blood every single day. Right? However, right, let's try another one. Now this is where habit comes in is quite important. Say that, for instance, last menstruation she had blood for 7 days. Okay. Now new month, right? She sees blood for 3 days, right? And then nothing for 10. Right? And then she sees 2 more days of blood, and then, right, it finishes. So how do we know? Right, so is 10 days enough for you to consider that 3 and that 2 separately? No. So that all of it's added together. Even the time of supposed purity is considered as if blood is continuing. So we have 3 days plus 10 days, right, plus 2 days is how many days? 15, right? So now we're well above the maximum. Right? Well above the maximum. So whenever, right, we'll mention this again in a second, but whenever a person goes above their habits and then continues above the maximum, right, what is considered hayd is just the habit. Right? Even, right, so say a woman, her habit is 7 days, right? She experiences blood for 7 days. And then it continues, 8 days, 9 days, 10 days, and then it goes above the maximum, right? So say 11 days, 12 days. The 7 days is considered menstruation because that was her habit last cycle. Right? The additional 5 is considered irregular bleeding, right? Because it went past the habit and past the maximum. Right? So anything that goes past the habit and the maximum, right, is irregular bleeding. But say, for instance, her habit last month was 7 days, and this month it goes, right, 7, 8, 9, and then it stops. Her new habit's 9 days. That's it, right? Even if it stops at 10, her new habit's 10 days. But once it goes 11, then we'll say, okay, no, 7 days, act as if it's hayd. You don't have to make up any of those prayers. But the additional 5 days that it went above the habit and the maximum, right, those days you would make up the prayers, right? And there's no sin on you for not knowing. But once it, obviously on the 11th day, you would know for sure, right? So 7 days is your habit, right? And the blood goes to 11, you would know that 7 was the hayd, the 3, right, is irregular, and right now I'm not in my menstruation. So, does that make sense? Anyone have any questions? Or? No, so the irregular bleeding is not seen as a major ritual impurity. It's minor ritual impurity. It's like nosebleed. Right? They literally say that it's similar to, because nosebleed is blood that's not from the womb. Right? And only the blood from the womb is menstruation. Right? So one of the women who had a big problem with irregular bleeding came to the Prophet, and he told her that to make wudu for the time of every prayer and pray even if blood is continuing while you're praying. Right? So it's not seen as the same rulings. Tamam. So if you have bleeding for whatever amount of days, and then you see 15 days of blood, of nothing, and then you have some other bleeding, they're considered completely separate. Same thing if a woman, she had postnatal bleeding for, say, a month, right? The maximum is 40 days, so say 30 days she had that, right? And then there's nothing for 15 days, right? Then she gets blood after that. That blood is considered her menstruation, because it's after the 15 days. It's not considered to have anything to do with the previous bleeding. Right? So if you have 15 days of nothing, then the two sides are considered separate. What happened before and what happened after are considered completely separate. Right? If it's less than 15 days, then they're considered as one. And the time in between is considered as if the blood is continuing. Tamam. Okay, so the irregular bleeding, we mentioned a few times already that it's anything that is less than 3 days. Right? So say a woman sees blood for 2 days and then 15 days nothing, right? Then that 2 days, even though on the onset she acts as if it's hayd, but then she knows for a fact that it's not because it never reached 3 days. So she may have to go back and make up those prayers, right? And there's no sin on her for that. So if she sees blood, she acts as if it's hayd. She acts as if it's menstruation. Right? And then if it doesn't reach 3 days, then she goes back and makes up the prayers. So less than 3 days in menstruation, more than 10 days in the menstruation, more than the maximum of the postnatal bleeding, the nifas, which is 40 days. So if it's 41, 42, 43, right, then that is considered irregular bleeding. Right? Any blood that's experienced during during pregnancy or before majority of the child comes out. Before majority of the child comes out. Right, so if it's like just the beginnings of pregnancy, like what the child is just starting to come out and there's blood there, that's not considered nifas. So you're not going to start your 40 days from that time. Right? Once majority of the baby comes out, sometimes it takes a long time, the baby, right? So once the majority of the baby comes out, if there's blood, then that's the beginning of nifas. And we'll do more about that in a second. Also, any blood before 9 years old or after 55 years old. Right? So here's a kind of a homework situation, which we'll do here, classwork. Right? She sees blood for 12 days. Okay? Red flag. What's the red flag? The maximum is 10 days. Very good. Right, so she sees blood for 12 days. Her habits in her previous menstruation was 7 days. Right? So it went above the habit and above the maximum. Right? So the answer is, right, the 7 days is considered her menstruation, and the additional 5 days is considered istihada. Right? It's considered irregular bleeding. Tamam. So on that 11th day, she would have already known that. Yeah, it'll stay 7. It'll stay 7. Good question. Right, but if her last habit was 7, and then today in this month it's 10, then her new habit's 10. Habit's 10. Okay, so the principle is, right, that if the bleeding exceeds the habit and goes beyond the maximum, right, then only the habit is considered the hayd, and the rest is considered irregular bleeding. So if it goes above the habit and above the maximum, then everything else after the habit is considered irregular bleeding. Obviously, when it gets to day 11, you know for a fact already. Right?
So the month after, then she'll look back and say my previous month was 7, or
7, right?
because it went above the maximum. But if it hadn't gone above the maximum, let's say if it was 10,
Yeah.
she'll look back and say my last habit was 10.
Exactly. Good. Some of this can be quite daunting details, but the principles are good. Right? They say that man ahkam al-usul la yakhaf al-furu'. That whoever understands the principles is not scared of the details. Right? So the principle is, if it goes above the habit and above the maximum, then everything above the habit is irregular bleeding, and that applies to the nifas as well, the postnatal bleeding. Right? However, in order for you to have a habit in postnatal bleeding, you would have to have had a child prior to that. So if it's your first child, you don't have a habit. Right? So we'll take that in a second. That this ruling applies to both the menstruation and the postnatal bleeding. That if the hypothetical situation is a girl, right? She becomes 9 years old, and she experiences the first onset of menstruation. Right? So that's her first menstruation. She doesn't have any habits, right? Any habit, right? But on her first menstruation, it goes above 10. What does she do? 10 days is considered the menstruation. Everything else is considered irregular bleeding. So we judge it by the maximum, because there is no habit. Same thing, a woman gives birth. She sees blood for 50 days. 10 days more than the maximum. But she never had a child before that. So what is considered the actual bleeding, postnatal bleeding? She sees blood for 50 days. Right? The maximum of nifas is only 40, but she doesn't have any habit. She never had a child before that. So what is considered the actual nifas, and what is considered irregular bleeding? 40, the maximum, 40, is considered what she had, right, her nifas, and everything else is considered irregular bleeding. So in the next pregnancy, her habit is 40. Good. Right. So this girl, she sees blood, right, at her first experience with menstruation, but then it goes above 10 days. Right. Then 10 is her maximum. The maximum is her habit, and the rest of the 20 days, right, is considered irregular bleeding if it hypothetically continues the whole month. Because some women may have excessive irregular bleeding, and that continues. And this has happened in history, and that's why the rulings are there. That a woman she reaches puberty, and her first menstruation, it never stops. It's just continuous blood every single day, at least something every single day. Right? And the blood does not ever stop for 15 whole days. And so it's all considered continuous. So every month she would just consider 10 is her hayd, 20 is her is irregular. 10 hayd, 20 irregular. I mean, yeah. Yeah. So some scholars said that 15 would be the tuhr, but the mu'tamad is that the whole rest of the 20 would be. That 20, because the rest of the month, we would say, right, would be. There is a khilaf though. Some said 15 and then another 10, and then 15 and then another 10. Right? But the final say was on the 10, 20, 10, 20, 10, 20. Now the same thing applies to postnatal bleeding. So say a woman has a baby and then the blood just continues. Right? Then 40 is that. Then the rest of up to the next 6 months is not considered nifas. Right? We'll talk about in a second if she gets pregnant again. That's why the 6 months is there. Right? That everything else is considered irregular bleeding until she gets pregnant again. Right? And then we'll talk about. It's kind of confusing. This one. Tamam. Right, so if it's continuous, right, bleeding, right, then there's one of the rulings, which is the rulings of the ma'dhur, the one who is excused from some of the stipulations of purity. Right, and this applies to any person who experiences any continuous excuse that would invalidate their state of purity. So if a person has a constant nosebleed that won't stop, right? How do you make wudu? Right? Because every time you put water in your face, your wudu is broken again. And you put water, it's broken. You'll never be able to make wudu. Right? And this applies to certain types of sicknesses. It applies to irregular bleeding if it's excessive, if it's a lot and it doesn't stop. Right? So how does one become excused? Right? And then what are the real rulings of a person who's considered excused? Right? So in order to affirm oneself as being excused, right, they have to meet this criteria, which is that the excuse itself, the impurity that's coming out, remains for an entire prayer time and does not stop for enough time that allows you to make a quick wudu and and to finish a full prayer. Right? So how much time would it take to wash your face, your arms, wipe your 1/4 of your head, and wash your feet quickly and pray a full prayer? Who can estimate? Anyone? 10 minutes, 15 minutes? And that's way too much. 5 minutes. Like the fastest, like the bare minimum of wudu, just the fard, right? And then just a bare minimum salat. 5 minutes. So 2 minutes is a bit. So say 5 minutes, if we're being generous. So if you're having, say for instance, a nosebleed, or a woman's having the irregular bleeding, right, from say Maghrib all the way to Isha, right, and they were never able to pray Maghrib because they tried to make wudu, it continues. It's not stopping for any amount of time. Right, for at least the 5 minutes that they would need to make the wudu and pray. And 5 minutes is just the estimation, but in general, if you're reasonably sure that it's going to continue, then you don't have to act on it. Right? Right, so the whole prayer time goes out, you didn't get to pray. Right, so now you're considered excused. Right? You're considered excused, and we'll talk about the rulings of the excused person. And you continue to be excused until as long as that every single subsequent prayer time comes, there's some portion, even if one drop, of that excuse. Right, so say between Maghrib and Isha, right, you tried your best to make a wudu, but your nose kept bleeding, right, and you were never able to pray. Right, so, right, you're considered excused, right, and then from Isha to Fajr, there was a little bit of bleeding, right, you're still excused. Fajr to Dhuhr, still a little bit of nosebleed, you're still excused. All the way until one entire prayer time comes and goes, and there was not a single drop or a single presence of that excuse. Right, so you begin to be excused if a whole prayer time comes and goes and you are not able to pray because there's not enough time for you to make a sufficient wudu and prayer. Right? You stay like that if there's any presence of that excuse in any further prayer time, and you no longer are excused if one whole prayer time comes and goes and none of that excuse is present. Right? This may be rare, but it does happen, right? And especially with other types of sicknesses, like for instance a person who has like an elderly person who has like a catheter that has, like, or they're not able to, they have something attached to them that's kind of draining their digestive system that they don't, because they can't use the restroom. Right? So there's constant blood, or somebody has a blood transfusion, and blood's constantly coming out. Right? Those are types of excuses also. Incontinence of urine, people constantly experience drops of urine that don't stop. Right? So, or if someone had a wound, for instance, right? Somebody has a wound and it won't stop bleeding. Right? If anyone has any experience in the trauma unit, you'll see this. People have wounds or cuts or gashes that are quite deep and it's just continuously coming. It's very hard to stop the blood. So if that happens for a whole prayer time, right? So these are examples. So irregular bleeding is one of the examples, and we mentioned the woman who came to the Prophet and he had this problem that it would constantly be continuous. Right? So he told her that to make wudu for the beginning of every prayer time. Right? And then pray as if normal, even if the blood is dripping, right, at that moment. Right? So the rulings of the excused person, that once you are considered excused by fulfilling the criteria, then you would have to make a new wudu for each, for the entering of each prayer time. Right? So if your wudu will break, right, by anything that would normally break the wudu except for that excuse. So if your excuse is a nosebleed, right, your wudu would break if you slept, your wudu would break if you used the restroom, your wudu would break if you, for instance, vomited a mouthful and the other things. But if your nose is bleeding, that does not break your wudu. Right? You're excused from that one thing. Or if a woman has the irregular bleeding, then if that happens, her wudu is still intact. Right? However, each time the prayer goes out, the prayer time finishes, right? And right, then the wudu would be broken if the excuse was present when they were making the wudu or after the wudu. So for instance, say dhuhr time comes in, what, 12 something? No? Just hypothetically, 12:30. Say dhuhr comes in at 12:30, right? And right, you make a wudu. Right? The excused person makes the wudu. Right? But when making the wudu, the nose is not bleeding, or there's no irregular bleeding, there's nothing at that moment of making the wudu. And then after that, right, nothing. Right? And then they pray, and then still nothing. And then the time goes out. Right? That time going out doesn't break the wudu because that excuse was not there. Right? You being excused or not wouldn't have affected anything. You made a proper wudu and nothing broke your wudu. Right? Not even that excuse. Right? But if you're, while making the wudu or afterwards, that excuse comes, you still have wudu. You still pray. But once the time goes out, your wudu is broken. Right? Once the time goes out, your wudu is broken. You have to make a new wudu for the next prayer time. Does that make sense? Okay. So sometimes the details can be a bit. So. Right, so the wudu breaks by the exiting of the prayer time, not by the entrance of the prayer time. Right, so where does the only situation where that applies is Fajr. Right? What is the exiting of Fajr time? Anyone? Sunrise. Good. So Fajr is the only time where one prayer exits, but another prayer doesn't come in. Right, so once the sun rises, the wudu is broken. Right? When dhuhr time comes in, she has to make a new wudu for dhuhr time. But if you make a wudu for dhuhr, when asr comes in, right, when dhuhr goes out, asr's in. So but if you say, for instance, after sunrise you made wudu, right, and then dhuhr came in, right, do you have to make a new wudu? That's it. I'll let you think about that one. So with that one wudu, right, one can pray whatever fard they want to pray, whatever nafil they want to pray. They can recite the Quran, they can touch the Quran, they can enter in the masjid, right? But they should take care that, right, the masjid is not dirtied by anything. They can do all of the rulings of someone who's in a state of purity. Right? They can have, and they can even have intercourse with their spouse, right? Because this type of blood is not considered adha, harm. Right? The prohibition is to have intercourse during haid, menstruation, or postnatal bleeding, right? But if a person is in an irregular state of bleeding, right, then intimacy is still allowed. Intimacy is still allowed. So, any questions on that before we close the next one?
I have a question about habits. So let's say,
Sure.
for example, I wasn't clear if one habit, 1 month, let's say for example, it's like between Asr and Maghrib, and then the next month. So because we've been talking about days, right?
Yeah.
So does she have to wait until that specific period, or does she just have to keep a lookout on that day?
Yeah, so the habit is just by amount of days. Nothing else is considered to be to affect the rulings. So like the characteristic of the blood, or when it started, when in that day did it start at night, did it start at day? None of that is considered to have any effect on the next month. Just the amount of days. How many days, from how many hours, you could say, from beginning to end. Right? And then that would carry on to the next month. And in other schools, they consider a lot of other details, like, right, characteristics, color, right, and a lot of things, but not in the Hanafi school. Hanafi school seem to be kind of the easiest of all of them. The last section, which we'll be touching on, would be the I really have no idea how this word's supposed to be. I was told that it's Lochia, or what was the other one? Lochia, right? Postnatal bleeding. Right? So by definition, right, it is the blood that is seen after a child is born, right, or after majority of the child comes out. Right? After majority of the child comes out. So say a child is being born, in the process of being born, but between crowning and actually the child fully coming out, there's a long time. Right? It could be a long time. Right? So if majority of the child is out, right, then, and there's blood, then the time starts from there. Because it might have implications. What if the prayer time just ended, or, right, is just about to end? So that 1-2 minutes could change everything. Right? So if we'll mention in a minute that what if you have your menstruation or your postnatal bleeding at the end of a prayer time, right? So just remind me if I don't mention it, but we'll mention it in a few. Right, so blood that is seen after the child is born. If there is no blood, in the hypothetical situation that there's no blood whatsoever, right, the woman only loses her wudu. The woman only loses her wudu because something came from one of the two passages, right? And that's a general, but it would still be a matter of caution to still take a ghusl, because even if it's one drop, right, that one couldn't see, then it's best to not take that chance and just make a ghusl. Right, so if blood comes out during the pregnancy, right, she's before the childbirth, right, that is not considered postnatal bleeding. That is considered irregular bleeding. Or if blood comes out and before the child, majority of the child is completely out. Right, so say the child is just crowning, right, and there's blood, that's not considered postnatal bleeding. That's considered irregular bleeding until majority or all of the child comes out. Right? There is no minimum of this postnatal bleeding. We mentioned even if it's one drop, right, then ghusl is obligatory. Right? But it can last, and sometimes does last, up to 40 days as a maximum. Right, so if the bleeding passes 40 days, it goes beyond 40 days, right? And there's never any 15-day period where there was nothing at all. Right? If you see 15 days of nothing, then you can consider that your postnatal bleeding is over, even if it's after the second day or the third day. But say you have bleeding for 5 days, and then 10 days nothing, then 5 more days and 10 days nothing. All of that is considered as one. If it goes more than 40, whatever is over 40 is irregular bleeding. If it's the first childbirth, right? If it's a second childbirth, then you will look at the previous habit. Right? If last time it was 20 days, and this time it went above 20 and above 40, so say 60, right? What is the ruling? Right? The first child was born, and she experienced blood for 20 days after the child was born. Right? The next childbirth, right, she experiences 60 days of blood. Right? What is the ruling of the second childbirth? Right, 20 days is considered to be the postnatal bleeding, and whatever is above the habit and above the maximum is considered irregular bleeding. So the same rule applies from menstruation to here. And this is why it's important to remember the previous habit. So if she has a habit, then the nifas is according to the habit, right? And the extra is istihada. It's irregular bleeding, right? If she doesn't have a habit, then the whole 40 days is considered to be her nifas, and the additional 20 in this circumstance would be irregular bleeding. So if it's the first child, then it tends to be easier, right? Rulings. And the last thing is based on, okay, sure.
If her second child, she was less than her habit.
Yeah, then her new habit would be that time. Right, so say the first child was 20 days, second child only 10 days. For her third child, she considers back to 10 days.
Does she pray after she has the sick? So when it's less than the habit,
Yeah.
previous habit, does the person start praying based on what's happening right now, or based on the
Right, so if the blood stops and she's reasonably sure that it's over and not going to come back, then she prays. Right? If it does come back, then we consider, was it 15 whole days or not? Right? But she acts on the basis of reasonable surety. I'm pretty sure it's over. Once one of the signs that it's over is that there's what they call al-bayad al-khalis, that there's a type of a white discharge. That's the sign that it's over, that the bleeding is over. Right? So if she sees that, definitely she would stop. She would start praying. She would do everything as normal. So, for instance, go ahead.
Is there a minimum amount of time that, if her habit was 20 days with the first child, and now, let's say it was 40 for the first one, second one, at 20 it stopped.
Yeah.
She doesn't know if it's going to be one of those, times where it stops and restarts.
Yeah.
So, and she wouldn't ovulate. Usually that's the ovulation, she's not ovulating.
Yeah.
So how much time would she wait until she starts praying?
That's a good question.
She's not continuously doing
Right.
Ghusl,
Yeah. Yeah. So, say her previous habit was 40 days, for those who didn't hear. 40 days. This time it stops at 20 days. At what point does she know for a fact that it's over and she can start praying? Right, so if she doesn't see the bayad al-khalis, right, the white discharge, which would be a sign that it's completely over, right, then she would act on the basis of reasonable surety. If it may be a day or 2 days, and then she realizes nothing's coming out anymore, right, then she can say, if she is reasonably sure that nothing is going to come out, and then she can start praying and acting on that. If something does come out, then she's not accountable for what happened in between. And then she would just go back to the same. Right?
what you just think.
Yeah, pretty much.
She could wait 3 days and then think, nothing's coming.
Yeah.
She'll do
So it's a bit harder if she doesn't have a habit, but if she's given birth before, she might be like, okay, no, I'm pretty sure it's over, like last time, kind of.
I'm just wondering at what point does it
Yeah.
She's just speculating.
Yeah, it's reasonable surety. Yeah, so if she's reasonably sure that it's not going to stop, then she'll pray. If she's like, it's possible that it's not going to come back.
But then, okay, like let's say in this case, 20 days, there's nothing. But then let's say day 35, she starts bleeding again.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, so if it wasn't 15 days, then that's still considered her nifas. Right? And all that prayer, right? Allah is Kareem. Allah will accept, inshallah, the effort. But technically she didn't have to pray those prayers, right? In retrospect. Right? But we never assume that Allah, that all that's just going to waste. Right? No, not at all. There's an interesting discussion about twins, because if we're saying that the baby coming out and the blood that comes with it is nifas, then what about if there's two babies, right? So, and in the Islamic terms, it doesn't have to be two babies born exactly at the same time, and they definitely don't have to look like each other, right? But any two children that are born within 6 months of each other are considered twins, right? Because the minimum of pregnancy is 6 months. Right? For you to have a full pregnancy, right, obviously it would be 9 months, but be considered a full pregnancy if it was 6 months, right? Which would be the minimum. Right? So if a child is born, say in January, right, and then say February, March, April, May, June, July, and in July the second one was born, so there's 6 months in between. They're two separate babies, right? They're two separate nifases, right? So if there was postnatal bleeding from the first one, it would be separate from the second one, right? They're two different. But if one child is born in January, right, and then less than 6 months later another child is born, they're considered as one pregnancy, one big pregnancy, right? They're twins technically. The only thing that this affects, really, it doesn't affect the nifas, because the nifas is from the first baby, right? It doesn't affect anything, right? But it does affect the waiting period, that if a woman is pregnant and a divorce occurs, then once the time once the divorce occurs, she has that waiting period, right? And the waiting period starts from when the baby is born, right? So if there's twins born, it's from the second baby, because Allah says hatta yada'na hamlahunna, that they conceive what they're carrying. So if there's still one baby left in there, it's still carrying, right? It's not considered iddah. That's just a side note. There was something I mentioned to remind me to say, so I forget already. Anyone remember what it was? Okay, very good. Right, so the period ends at the end of the time. Right, so this applies to Ramadan as well. So say a woman is fasting, right, from Fajr, and then just before Maghrib she gets her menstruation, that day doesn't count. Right? If, for instance, she has her menstruation, but she gets her menstruation finishes before the ending of the prayer time, enough that she could have made a wudu and said Allahu Akbar, then that prayer is in her responsibility. So even if she didn't get to do that, she would have to go back and repeat that prayer. So say Maghrib comes in 6:30, right? Her menstruation finished at 5:30, right? Then obviously Asr is obligatory on her. Right? So that would be normal, because she could make a ghusl and pray the prayer. But if it's right, if her menstruation finishes at 5:50 or 5:55 and it's really close, then does she have to pray Asr or not? If there's enough time that she can make a full ghusl and say Allahu Akbar, right, at least start the prayer, then that prayer is obligatory. If it's not even enough time for that, say there's 3 minutes left, 2 minutes left, that she wouldn't even be able to if she tried, right, then she doesn't have to pray the Asr itself. Right? That Asr was never in her responsibility. Right? She would start having to pray from Maghrib.
Could she have fasted if it ends in the middle of the day? Like before
If it ends in the middle of the day, no. But if it ends just before Fajr, right, at any moment, even 1 minute before Fajr comes in, then she can fast. She can fast. She doesn't have to take ghusl for the fasting, because purity is not a condition of the fast, but she does have to take it for Fajr, for the Fajr prayer. Because Allah says that you're allowed to have intimate relationships all the way up until the sun, that you can see the white thread from the black thread of Fajr, meaning the Fajr time comes in. Right? So all the way up till, that would necessitate that a person would start the fast in a state of impurity. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Right? They would just take a ghusl and pray Fajr and then continue their fast. In the ghusl, they won't go too much extent in rinsing the mouth, just slightly, just so they don't break their fast. Same with the nose. But, any other questions?
Sorry for the annoying question. So if it's less than the habit,
Mm-hmm.
she can still, and she's sure she's sure it's done. She can fast, she can pray, but she can't be intimate, right?
Yeah,
Less than the habit, the previous one.
Yeah, so she'll fast, she'll pray. As normal, once she's reasonably sure that it's not going to come back, she stops. Right? She fasts, she prays, but she can't have relations until the habit time is finished. Same thing applies to nifas. So the first childbirth was 20 days. Right? Second childbirth, it stops at 15 days. Right? So in that 5 days in between, right, she will pray and fast, but she won't have relations with the spouse until the 20, because of the overwhelming possibility of it returning. So, any other questions?
But you said there, for example, with an unattached cover, is that only for minor injury or also?
No, it would be for, if it's for minor, then most definitely it would be for major. Right? The only difference would be that in major ritual impurity, you can't even say the Quran. So if someone doesn't have wudu, they can recite the Quran. It would be less reward than if they were to make wudu and then recite. But the prohibition is only in touching for the minor state of impurity. So, I don't expect the brothers to ask too many questions.
If she's at a point where she can't predict her cycle, so it keeps changing.
Yeah.
So, and then let's say she's having a cycle, and then she doesn't see anything, let's say after day 5.
Yeah.
But she knows before, it used to be like whatever, 79. Then at what I'm just worried about, is there any point where she's sinful for waiting to see if anything happens, or is she required to
Yeah.
make herself start praying?
That's a,
No, because she knows her cycles.
yeah.
Like it's very common with perimenopause, right? You no longer know your cycle. It's very irregular. So the question is, like, at what point is she required?
Yeah.
Again, it goes back to the one.
It does, but there are some helpers for that dhan. So like, for instance, the habit would be whatever the previous cycle was, right? Even if like 1 month, it's never the same every 2 months. Right? Yeah, so like say last month it was 3, or say 5, and this month it's 7, and then the next month it's, right? So whatever the previous month was, say the previous month was 7, and this month at 5, right, there's nothing. Right? So part of her dhan, to help her in her reasonable surety, would be that, okay, last month it was at least 2 more days, so let me wait to see. Right? So that could help. And if nothing comes, and then she's like, I'm pretty sure that it's over, then she can act on that. But if she's pretty sure that it's over and she doesn't pray, then yeah. Yeah. So that's why it's more about the surety, because no ruling can really tell you the... yeah. Yeah, but if someone's reasonably sure that it's not going to, and then they don't pray, then they would be sinful. Right? Right? But if they're in doubts and they don't pray, then they don't have to pray. If they're in doubt, they shouldn't pray. So the basis is that it's there, right? And you need reasonable surety to deem that it's not. Allah bless you, Sayyidi. Saqakumullah, sharab al-tahur. Right, so the basis is that the blood is there, right? That the menstruation continues, that the postnatal bleeding continues, and you would need at least reasonable surety to consider yourself pure. Right? So it's not the other way around. Right? That you don't have to prove yourself to be in a state of menstruation. You have to prove yourself out of it, right? Either by reasonable surety or certainty. However,
Of the topic is we're perimenopause. It's very normal to have istihada. I didn't know that. So
Mm.
to go 14, 15 day cycle, and it's considered normal because you didn't see anything for like, and you didn't have a cycle for 3 months, and then suddenly you get one, and it's 15 days. And it's considered normal, like health-wise, but here, I guess you know what to do because you look at your habit.
Mm. There's one issue called the muhayyira. There's a difference. Is muhayyara or muhayyira? The bewildered woman. Either she's bewildered or she bewilders the mufti, because she has the irregular bleeding, but she doesn't know her habit. She completely lost track. Right? And so what do you do? Because we mentioned that, like, okay, the habit is the menstruation, and whatever is additional and above the maximum is. But what if you don't know your habit? It's a problem. So that's why it's obligatory to keep track.
If we're going with the scenario that, let's say, it stops at 5, the woman decides to wait until 7 to make sure. When she's sure that it has stopped at 5, would she make up the prayers that she missed?
Yeah. She'll act accordingly. So sometimes you might have to act in retrospect. So you prayed prayers that you didn't actually have to pray, or you didn't pray when you should have prayed. That's not on your responsibility, right? You would act accordingly, right? So you make up that fast or that prayer, but you're not sinful for that. Jazakumullah khairan wa sallallahu ta'ala ala sayyidina Muhammad wa sallam. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Inshallah, next week we'll talk about cleaning impurities, how to remove najasa, inshallah.